Good evening. Thank you. I'm Bernard Schwartz, the director of the 92nd Street Y Zunterberg Poetry Center, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's event with Ben Lerner and Maggie Nelson. Following their readings, Ben and Maggie will sit for a conversation and take audience questions. If you have a question, come to one of the microphones at the front of each aisle. After the Q&A, there'll be a signing in the art gallery next door, and books will be available for purchase at that time, courtesy of Postman Books. Programming a season of readings is as much about the calendar as kinship, but it's worth noting that tonight's event features two real-life friends. Most of you probably knew that already. Just as readers of the Topeka School will know that Ben has set a climactic scene in his new novel at a John Ashbery reading in this very room. Thinking about literary friendship over time, the effects of presence and lines of influence, the overlap of private history and public performance, one might see tonight's event as keeping company with other evenings in the Poetry Center's past. Carson McCullers and Tennessee Williams in 1954, James Merrill and Elizabeth Bishop in 1973, John Ashbery and James Schuyler in 1989, Robert Lowell and Adrienne Rich in 1968. You go on exploring and accumulating more resources, wrote Robert Lowell to Adrienne Rich. It seems you more and more have worked out a style of your own, one that combines the casual and the splendid, the organized and the wild leap. And now there's perhaps no one in the country one can expect more from. Almost everyone is caught in the dilemma of starting again, a little threadbare, having junked too much in desperation and the desire to be fresh. The renewal of life, the taking in of its generous detail, the keeping open, the keeping daring, has everything to do with finding some frame or form. We walk our own roads, more or less, but we all walk, making different lines on the same surface. Plenty of writers, past and present, have been sustained by letters like this one from their writer friends. Plenty of ordinary people, too. And now please join me in welcoming Ben Lerner to this stage.
Hi. Bernard mentioned that there's a climactic scene in the 92nd Street Y in this book. There are actually two scenes of like mental breakdown that take place at the 92nd Street Y in the book. I wanted to read one of those scenes, but then I thought it would be kind of dangerous that I would reenact it and disassociate and then have to put it in another novel. But this is a very important place for me, and so it's always an honor to get to be here. And I don't know if Maggie can hear me backstage, but maybe she can't, which will make it easier to say how absolutely crucial she is for my writing life. I mean, as a friend and an interlocutor, and particularly for this book, which I was often thinking about abandoning, and was often sustained by her intelligence and support and her willingness to tell me when I had more work to do. So it's really great to get to read with her and be in conversation with her, and then the rest of you guys. I'm just going to read from the very beginning of the novel. They were drifting on her stepfather's boat in the middle of an otherwise empty man-made lake encircled by large tract houses. It was early autumn, and they were drinking Southern Comfort from the bottle. Adam was in the front of the boat watching a changeable blue light across the water that was probably a television seen through a window or glass door. He heard the scrape of her lighter, then saw smoke float over him, unravel. For a long time, he had been speaking. When he turned to see what effect his speech had had, she was gone, jeans and sweater in a little pile with the pipe and lighter. He said her name, suddenly aware of the surrounding quiet, and put his hand on the water, which was cold. Unthinkingly, he lifted her white sweater and smelled the wood smoke from earlier that evening in Clinton Lake, the synthetic lavender of what he knew to be her shower gel. He said her name again, louder now, then looked around. A few birds skimmed the undisturbed surface of the lake. No, those were bats. When did she dive or step off the boat, and how could she have made no splash, and what if she was drowned? He yelled now. A dog responded in the distance. From spinning around in search of her, he felt dizzy and sat down. Then he stood again and looked along the edges of the boat. Maybe she was just beside it, stifling her laughter, but she wasn't. He would have to pilot the boat back to the dock where she must be waiting. There was a dock for every 2 or 3 subdivisions. He thought he saw a firefly signal slowly from the shore, but it was too late in the year for that. He felt the wave of anger rising, and he welcomed it, wanted it to overwhelm his panic. He hoped Amber had dived into the water before his rambling confession of feeling. He'd said they'd stay together once he left Topeka for school, but now he knew they wouldn't. He was eager to demonstrate his indifference as soon as he found her safe on land. See the outboard motor gleaming in the moonlight. For any of his friends, managing the boat would be easy. All of them, even the other foundation kids, exhibited a basic Midwestern mechanical competence, could change their oil or clean a gun, whereas he couldn't even drive stick. He located what he assumed was a starter rope, pulled it, nothing happened. He pushed what must have been the throttle to another position and tried again, nothing. He was beginning to wonder if he might have to swim. He wasn't sure how well he swam. When he saw the key in the ignition, he turned it and the engine started up. As slowly as possible, he motored back to shore. When he approached the land, he turned the engine off but failed to bring the boat in parallel with the dock. A loud crack when the fiberglass hit the wood, which silenced the nearby bullfrogs. Nothing seemed damaged, not that he really looked. He rushed to throw the lines gathered in the boat around the cleats nailed to the dock, quickly improvised some knots, then pulled himself out of the boat. He prayed that no one was watching him from a window. Without taking the keys or her clothes or pipe or bottle, he sprinted up the incline through the wet grass toward her house. If the boat drifted back out on the water, that would be her fault. The large glass doors facing the lake were always unlocked. He slid one open quietly and went in. Only now did he feel the cold sweat. He could make out her brother's shape on the couch, pillow over his head, sleeping in the glow of the large television. The news was on mute. The room was otherwise dark. He thought of waking him, but instead removed his Timberland boots, which he assumed were muddy, and crept across the room to the white carpeted stairs. He went up slowly. He'd stayed over 2 or 3 times before when she'd told her parents he'd had too much to drink. They'd thought he'd slept in the guest room. They'd thought correctly that he'd called home. But the prospect of encountering anyone now, when he hadn't even confirmed that she was present, horrified him. Her mom took sleeping pills. He'd seen the oversized prescription bottle, knew she mixed them nightly with her wine. Her stepdad had slept through a brawl at a recent party. They'll never wake up, he reassured himself. Just don't knock anything over. He was glad to be in his socks. He reached the first floor and surveyed the dark, expansive living room before he climbed the next flight of stairs to where the bedrooms were. He could almost make out the large, generic hunting scene on the far wall, dogs flushing game from the woods beside a lake at sunset. He could see the red light blinking on the panel for the alarm system they thankfully never armed, and a little light collected around the silver edges of the framed family photographs on the mantel, teenagers in sweaters posing on a leaf-strewn lawn, her brother holding a football. Something ticked and settled in the giant kitchen. He went upstairs. Hers was the first open door on the right, and without turning on the light, he could see from the doorway that Amber was in her bed under the covers, breathing steadily. His shoulders relaxed. The relief was profound, and the relief made more room for anger. It also let him realize how badly he had to piss. He turned and crossed the hall into the bathroom and carefully shut the door, and without turning on the light, lifted the lid. On second thought, he lowered the seat again and sat down. A car passed slowly outside, its headlights illuminating the bathroom through an open Venetian blind. It wasn't her bathroom. The electric toothbrush, the hair dryer, these particular soaps, these were not her toiletries. For an instant, he thought, desperately hoped, that they might belong to her mother, but there were too many other discrepancies. The shower door was different, its glass frosted. Now he smelled the lemon-scented gel beads in a jar atop the toilet. Alien dried flowers hung from a purple sachet on the wall. In a single shudder of retrospection, his impressions of the house were changed. Where was the piano that nobody played? Wouldn't he have seen the electric chandelier? The carpet on the stairs, wasn't the pile too thick, too dark in the dark to have been truly white? Along with the sheer terror of finding himself in the wrong house, with his recognition of its difference, was a sense, because of the house's sameness, that he was in all the houses around the lake at once, the sublime of identical layouts. In each house, she or someone like her was in her bed, sleeping or pretending to sleep. Legal guardians were farther down the hall, large men snoring. The faces and poses and the family photographs on the mantel might change, but would all belong to the same grammar of faces and poses. The elements of the painted scenes might vary, but not the level of familiarity and flatness. If you opened any of the giant stainless steel refrigerators or surveyed the faux marble islands, you would encounter matching modular products in slightly different configurations. He was in all the houses, but precisely because he was no longer bound to a discrete body, he could also float above them. It was like looking at the miniature train set Klaus, his dad's friend, had given him as a child. He didn't care about the trains, could barely make them run, but he loved the scenery, the green static flocking spread over the board, the tiny yet towering pines and hardwoods. When he looked at the impossibly detailed trees, he occupied two vantages at once. He pictured himself beneath their branches and also considered them from above. He was looking up at himself, looking down. Then he could toggle rapidly between these perspectives, these scales in a relay that unfixed him from his body. Now he was frozen in fear in this particular bathroom and in all the bathrooms simultaneously. He looked down from 100 windows at the little boat on the placid man-made lake. Touches of white paint atop the dried acrylic add a sense of motion and of moonlight to the surface. He swam back into himself. He felt like a timer had started somewhere, that he had minutes, maybe only seconds, to flee the house into which he'd unintentionally broken before someone emptied a shotgun into his face or the cops arrived to find him hovering outside the bedroom of a sleeping girl. Fear made it difficult to breathe, but he told himself that he would press rewind, quietly walk back out the way he'd come, disturbing no one. That's what he did, although now the little differences called out to him as he descended. There was a large L-shaped couch he hadn't seen before. He could tell the coffee table here was glass and not dark wood like hers. At the bottom of the stairs, he hesitated. The front door was right there, beckoning. He'd be free. But his Timberlands were downstairs where he'd left them. To recover them, he'd have to pass the sleeping stranger. Despite his fear that he might at any moment be discovered, he decided he must go after his boots, less because they were evidence, could be traced to him, than because he felt that he'd be risking ridicule, humiliation, if he returned to her barefoot. He could intuit the shape of the story, could sense that it would spread, how she'd left him first to mishandle the boat and then to lose his fucking footwear in the midst of whatever misadventure. Hey, Gordon, you got your shoes tied on? Got your slippers? A memory from middle school of Sean McCabe coming home in socks and tears after he'd been jumped for his Air Jordans flared up before him. Sean still got shit about it, and Sean could now bench 300 pounds. The young man who had been her brother had turned his face toward the back of the couch. The pillow had fallen to the floor. The giant head of Bob Dole moved its lips on the screen as he crept past. He picked up his boots and slowly slid open the door. The rollers jammed a little. He had to apply some force, causing a loud squeak. The body on the couch stirred and started to sit up. All over Lake Sherwood housing community, the bodies stirred and started to sit up. Without closing the door, he bolted, boots in hand, over the wet grass, indifferent to uneven ground, to sticks and stones, at a speed he might never match again, his body grateful for something to do with its adrenaline. No one yelled after him. There was only his footfall, blood thundering in his ears. He triggered a few motion lights and so moved closer to the water. He ran at full force for a minute before he realized he wasn't sure where he was going. He dropped to a knee, lungs burning, looked behind him to make sure he wasn't being followed. He pulled his boots on over his wet socks. Then he got up and sprinted between two houses until he reached the street. His only goal now was to find his red '89 Camry parked in her driveway and go home to bed. He was still scared. At any moment he might hear sirens, but away from the water and the scene of his ridiculous trespass, he felt the worst was over. He patted his pocket to confirm the presence of his keys and walked quickly along the curb. There were no sidewalks, but he did not run so as to minimize suspicion on the off chance he was seen. He walked and walked, ashamed to be on foot. He could not find his car, her house. He must have pointed the boat in exactly the wrong direction. After he'd searched for almost half an hour, had circled half the lake he saw, was overjoyed to see his car where he had parked it some hours before. The sound of the doors unlocking was deeply reassuring. He got in, found his pack of Marlboro Reds on the passenger seat and shook one loose. He turned the key to the on position but did not start the engine. He lowered the window and lit his cigarette with a yellow Bic he took from the cup holder and inhaled what felt like his first full breath since he'd discovered her absence on the boat. He started the engine and turned the headlights on to discover that she was standing, had been standing, in the threshold of her front door wearing an oversized sweater. Her almost waist-length dark blonde hair was down. He cut the engine reflexively, turning off the lights. Barefoot, she walked to the car and opened the passenger door and got in. She helped herself to a cigarette, lit it, and said, as though he were a few minutes late for an appointment, "Where have you been?" He was furious. He could not admit that he'd been scared, couldn't say he'd been unequal to managing the boat or that he'd almost confronted the wrong young woman in another house. He demanded an explanation. "What the fuck is wrong with you?" "I wanted to swim," she said, and shrugged and smoked when he pressed, tobacco mixing with the smell of her conditioner. Absently, she began playing with his hair. My stepdad used to give these like endless speeches at dinner. Now he barely talks, and anyway, we don't eat together. I think he's depressed, like he should have a therapist, see your parents at the foundation. It's weird now that he's quiet because before he would make dinners into these long fucking discussions, except not really because nobody discussed anything. He just talked in our direction. He'd ask my brother a question every once in a while, but it was always like, "Pop quiz, what did I say made this a hard time for the aeronautics business?" You know, he got rich off somebody else's invention, some kind of screw that doesn't weigh anything. And my brother would never have to answer because my stepdad answered his own fucking questions, and the answer was always China, basically. Then there was this one night last summer when my mom was letting me sneak white wine and my brother was out and I had to be the one at the table getting talked at, and it was getting on my nerves for real. Maybe it was because I was a little fucked up or because I'm just older now and so like more aware of my mom, what she's been through, starting with my dad. But anyway, I did this stupid, also kind of awesome thing. Really, really slowly, I started lowering myself in my chair, like sliding down out of it, while he was eating his ravioli, talking about whatever. My mom was already in the kitchen loading the dishwasher. She never eats. It required a lot of core strength going down so slowly. All those crunches, all that crystal, joking. At dance, they are always telling me to visualize a movement as I do it, and I was visualizing myself as a liquid flowing down the chair, all the way down off my chair until I was literally under the table and my stepdad still hadn't noticed anything and my mom was in there cleaning and I was trying not to laugh. Or maybe cry, Adam asked, and she looked at him, at how fucking sad this dude is, maybe. Or yeah, like for my mom who is married to him, like he doesn't realize the audience has gone home while he's just going on. And then I seal crawl so slowly under the table across the carpet, holding my breath into the kitchen. My mom has stopped cleaning, and now she's on the other side of the island and doesn't see me, and I stand up really quietly. She's holding her pink wine, looking out the window at the lake or more at her reflection in the glass because it's night. I get the bottle from the fridge door and pour most of it into a plastic cup and come up to her with my big gulp, and she's coming back from Mars and about to say something to me, but I shush her with a finger on my lips and whisper, "Listen." We can hear my stepdad in the dining room telling nobody about Ross Perot. He was obsessed with Ross Perot in China. And my mom maybe doesn't understand what's going on yet, but we tiptoe over to the doorway and stand there looking into the dining room while he talks to the air like AM radio and wine is almost coming out of my nose. We stand there forever before he looks up, like we caught him beating off. He looks at my chair, then back at us, and now my mom and I start really cracking up. And then he gets this fucked up smile that's pure rage, like, how dare you bitches laugh at me? But I give him the stepdaughter smile back and hold it, hold it. We basically have a staring contest, and my mom's laughter gets all nervous until finally his face relaxes and it's all a big joke. It would take Adam 20 years to grasp the analogy between her slipping from the chair and from the boat. Thank you very much.
That scene is so funny. It's so great to see you all here, even though I can't totally see you. And I could hear Ben when I was in the back. And if you can hear me now, Ben, I just want to say back to you that this is such a pleasure to do this with him. And everything he said about my being helpful to him is true about his being helpful to me as a writer. And it's just luck that we found and have each other in this world of writing. So I'm thrilled to be here, and unlike Ben, who's had several intense experiences at the Y in a myriad of formats, I've actually never been in this room before, so it's really a pleasure to be here, totally anew, and oh great, and yeah, so we're going to talk in a little bit, so I won't read for too long, and but I thought this book, Bluets, of mine was published in 2009, which means it's 10 years old this year, and Wave Books, really great press in Seattle that made this book for me happen. They made a very lovely 10-year anniversary copy of it. I'm not sure if it's on sale here, but it's a really lovely hardback. But the book has been newly in my mind, so I thought I would read from it because it's a little bit fresher to me than more recent work that I've read quite a bit of. So I'm going to read a little bit, just a few pages from Bluets, and then I'm going to read just a couple pages of something new that I have been working on. So for reasons that will become clearer later when I talk with Ben about time and memory, which I think are really critical concepts in his writing, I have picked out a little bit of this book that addresses the same. So it begins at what I call propositions. They're numbered pieces. Proposition number 198. So 198. I guess you should know if you don't know this book. It's about ostensibly the color blue, but weaved into it is also a heartbreak and some other things. So it's kind of a book about beauty and pain. So 198. In a 1994 interview, about 20 years after he wrote Famous Blue Raincoat, Leonard Cohen admitted that he could no longer remember the specifics of the love triangle that the song describes. Quote, "I always felt that there was an invisible male seducing the woman I was with. Now, whether this one was incarnate or merely imaginary, I don't remember," end quote. I find this forgetting quite heartening and quite tragic in turns. 199. For to wish to forget how much you loved someone, and then to actually forget, can feel at times like the slaughter of a beautiful bird who chose by nothing short of grace to make a habitat of your heart. I have heard that this pain can be converted, as it were, by accepting the fundamental impermanence of all things. This acceptance bewilders me. Sometimes it seems an act of will, at others of surrender. Often I feel myself to be rocking between them. Seasickness. 200. You cannot step into the same river twice. A heartening anthem, without a doubt. But really, this is but one version of the fragment left behind by Heraclitus, who was justly nicknamed the Riddler or the Obscure. Other versions include, on those stepping into rivers, staying the same other and other waters flow. We step and do not step into the same river. We are and we are not. You cannot step twice into the same river, for other waters and yet others go flowing on. It seems that something is staying the same here, but what? 201. I believe in the possibility, the inevitability even, of a fresh self stepping into ever-fresh waters, as in the variant, quote, no man ever steps into the same river twice, for it's not the same river and he's not the same man, end quote. But I also sense something in Heraclitus's fragment that allows for the possibility of a mouse shocking its snout on a hunk of electrified cheese over and over again in a kind of static eternity. 202. For the fact is that neuroscientists who study memory remain unclear on the question of whether each time we remember something, we're accessing a stable memory fragment, sometimes called a trace or an engram, or whether each time we remember something, we are literally creating a new trace to house the thought. And since no one has yet been able to discern the material of these traces, nor to locate them in the brain, how one thinks of them remains mostly a matter of metaphor. They could be scribbles, they could be holograms or imprints, they could live in spirals or rooms or storage units. Personally, when I imagine my mind in the act of remembering, I see Mickey Mouse in Fantasia, roving about in a milky navy blue galaxy, shot through with twinkling cartoon stars. 203. I remember back in the 80s when crack first hit the scene, hearing all kinds of horror stories about how if you smoked it even once, the memory of its unbelievable high would live on in your system forever, and you would thus never again be able to be content without it. I have no idea if this is true, but I will admit it scared me off the drug. In the years since, I have sometimes found myself wondering if the same principle applies in other realms. If seeing a particularly astonishing shade of blue, for example, or letting a particularly potent person inside you could alter you irrevocably, just to have seen it or felt it. In which case, how does one know when or how to refuse or how to recover? 204. Lately, I have been trying to learn something about the fundamental impermanence of all things from my collection of blue amulets, which I have placed on a ledge in my house that is, for a good half of the day, drenched in sunlight. This placement is intentional. I like to see the sun pass through the blue glass, the bottle of blue ink, the translucent blue stones. But the light is clearly destroying some of the objects, or at least it is bleaching out their blues. Daily, I think about moving the most vulnerable objects to a cool, dark place. But the truth is, I have little to no instinct for protection. Out of laziness, out of curiosity, out of cruelty, if one can be cruel to objects, I have given them up to their diminishment. 205. One of the most vulnerable items is a scrap of paper that reads, "You said you think of blue," written to me by a lover from long ago. Onto this note, he pasted a square of ripped blue paper, which he then meticulously stitched back together. The whole apparatus is now falling apart. The stitches are peeling off, the words fading. This seems just, as this lover was always breaking things and then coming up with ingenious means of rigging them back together. In each place he lived, he built a bed high in the air, served by a precarious ladder, and then placed precious orchids on wobbly stands near the bottom of the ladder, so that often one would knock the flowers down on one's descent. This man had one tattoo, a navy blue snake, which I liked to watch dance against the white of his wrist when the rest of his hand had disappeared inside me. He got this tattoo to commemorate the night that all of his snakes died, a winter night in Connecticut when it was so cold and the heat shut off, so he put as many lights as possible against the snake's cage to try to keep them warm. And then we fell asleep and the heat came back on and the snakes overheated and died. God, no one's ever laughed at that line before. It's like, you guys are special. All right, this was much worse than knocking over an orchid. This man once taught me how to kill a mouse by thwapping it against the table while holding onto its tail. You do that if the snake strikes and wounds but doesn't kill. It's cruel to keep the mouse alive, he said, just because the snake has lost interest. Eventually, he got a new snake, a rainbow boa named Buttercup, a rope of incandescence. Buttercup's colors were a source of endless fascination to me, but she was 5 feet long and strong, and I did not like to feel her coil around my biceps if he wasn't in the room. Near the end, which neither of us quite saw coming, he said he had a surprise for me, and this surprise was another blue tattoo, this one a distorted circle at the base of his neck. It was very beautiful on him, very simple. I didn't live with it long enough to know about what it did. 206. Perhaps writing is not really pharmacon, but more of a mordant, a means of binding color to its object, or feeding it into it like a tattoo needle drumming ink into skin. But mordant, too, has a double edge. It derives from mordere, to bite. So it is not just a fixative or a preserver, but also an acid, a corrosive. Did I have this double meaning in mind when I told you, a little over a year ago, after it became clear that I would lose you, or that I had already lost you, that you were etched into my heart? I may not have known then that etch derives from etzin or etzgen, to be eaten. But in the days since, I have come to know the full meaning of the root. 207. I can remember a time when I took Henry James's advice, try to be one of those people. Actually, that's not what he said. He said, try to be one of the people on whom nothing is lost, deeply to heart. I think I was then imagining that the net effect of becoming one of those people would always be one of accretion. Whereas if you truly become someone upon whom nothing is lost, then loss is not lost on you either. All right, so that's from that book. And then I think that, oh, thanks. Ben and I were talking about, it feels unimaginative to read it from the beginning of a book, but then you don't have to say anything about it, which is why, probably in part why he read that, and why I'm now going to read you this, which is at present the opening of a new book, which I'm really pleased to finally be able to say I think will be out in 2021. And oh, great! And this book is a real needle like from Bluets in terms of this is a critical book about notions of freedom and liberation, and it's not written in the same zone of what I just read. So bear with me, and I'll just read you the first few pages. So this is from the introduction, which is called "The Feeling of Freedom." I had wanted to write a book about freedom. I had wanted to write this book at least since the subject emerged as an unexpected subtext in a book of mine about art and cruelty. I had set out then to write about cruelty and found, to my surprise, freedom coming up through the cracks, light and air into cruelty's stuffy room. Once done with cruelty, as if, I turned to freedom directly. I started in a basic sounding place, What is Freedom by Hannah Arendt, and began to amass my piles. But the center did not hold. I got diverted, perhaps literally, and I published a book about care. Some people thought the book about care was also a book about freedom. This was satisfying, as I too felt this to be the case. For a moment, I thought a book on freedom might not be necessary, not by me, maybe not by anyone. Can you think of a more depleted, imprecise, or weaponized word? I used to care about freedom, but now I care mostly about love, one friend told me, neatly summarizing certain elements of the lefty zeitgeist. That's a white word, said another, shaking her head. Such skepticism was underscored by a teensy informal poll I conducted at the outset, in which I reached out to a few people whose thinking on the subject I had long admired, and asked them to describe where freedom, be it political or spiritual, for lack of better words, those are James Baldwin's, ranked in their thinking these days. Here are a few of their responses. First, freedom feels like a corrupt and emptied code word for war, a commercial export, something a patriarch might give or rescind, whereas consciousness, empathy, agential relativisms feel big, crucial. 2, I am wary to the point of disbelief in anything like spiritual freedom or political freedom or their combination, because all of these seem to me predicated on individuation, which I don't believe in, and which I think is brutally unsustainable for the earth. 3, I think race as a feeling and a reality is equally big. 4, and lastly, I guess what I'm trying to say is that the individual self as both concept and lived reality is important to me, but I'm losing faith in that self as representative of the most essential form of political freedom. I now have a nagging sense that there's a freedom that I cannot have alone. Sifting through these responses, I realized that I had been, for the first time in my own adult writing life, unable to begin without knowing what living others to whom I felt indebted were thinking and feeling. I guess I too couldn't think or feel freedom alone. Truth be told, nor was I the only one who couldn't quit it, for there were other responses in addition to the above. One respondent wrote, "Freedom is one of those words, those ideals I cannot abandon despite all of its historical baggage." Another offered me a story. When I was a girl of 16, I got my driver's license and purchased my first car for $600 and was suddenly outside the reach of a man who'd sexually abused me for most of my life. In that case, in my car on the open road, I was literally suddenly free, and I felt it. Another called the feeling of freedom very, 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 very important. In fact, it's how I know I will survive. These responses also mattered. They bolstered my desire to write about the feeling or the feelings of freedom, and to give these feelings their due in a culture which presumes that such feelings matter only when converted into tangible political action or achievement, a presumption which correlates to the conviction that a political life is the only kind of life we live, or the only kind most worth living, which I do not believe. I had also wanted to write about feelings of unfreedom, and not just the kind that stem from unjust or unwanted circumstances. I wanted to address the kinds that correlate to urges towards duty, constraint, surrender, submission, even love, as to repress or ignore such urges seemed to me to misapprehend the complexity of liberatory impulse and experiment, not to mention the paradoxes that enliven our daily lives. In other words, I wanted to write about knots of freedom and unfreedom. We tend to treat these knots as the source of great injustice, perfidy, and pain. Very often they are. This is especially so when we consider the intimate link between slavery and freedom in Western history and thought. Not just the ways in which they developed together and give each other meaning, but also the ways in which white people have cannily used the discourse of freedom to deny, delay, or diminish it for others. And yet, because I believe there is more to be found in these knots than a blueprint for past and present regimes of brutality, I felt the need to slow down and spend some time bringing lucidity to the tangle. There was, of course, a certain blurriness at the heart of my polling enterprise, insofar as it treated freedom, again, be it political or spiritual or otherwise, as a word whose meaning was self-evident or shareable, when really the word operates more like God. That is, we can never really be sure when we use it what exactly we are talking about, or whether we're talking about the same thing. Are we talking about negative freedom, positive freedom, anarchist freedom, Marxist freedom, abolitionist freedom, libertarian freedom, white settler freedom, Buddhist freedom, decolonizing freedom, and so on? This was Ludwig Wittgenstein's point, made in explanation of his famous edict, "The meaning of a word is its use." As Wittgenstein's own work makes clear, this edict need not cause paralysis or lament, even if such states remain a temptation or threat. It can instead be an incitement to turn our attention toward which language game is being played. Such is the approach taken in the pages that follow, in which freedom acts as a reusable train ticket, marked or perforated by the many stations, hands, and vessels through which it passes. For whatever the confusions wrought by talking about freedom, they do not, in essence, differ from the misunderstandings we risk when we talk to one another about other things, even if those attending freedom are especially fraught. And talk to one another we must, even or especially if we are, as poet George Oppen put it, no longer sure of the words. All right, so that was that. And now, thank you. And now Ben and I are going to talk. So great, I'm going to sit down.
There's more water.
I know, we can share. So this is fun. So I thought maybe I would just start because, I mean, I knew that Ben, I knew that you were going to read the beginning of your book, and it's such a great opening for many reasons, but one of which is, you guys got, the end of the whole set piece is the line about taking Adam 20 years to recognize the parallel between Amber slipping out in the car seat, in front of her stepdad, and then from the car. And I guess, something that your writing does all the time is, I think of it as delivering what I might call temporal abundance, in terms of sometimes it's because something echoes or comes back or it twins and it's a parallel. Sometimes it's because, and you told me earlier today, and now I forgot it again, but the refrain in your book, tell me how this scene led to.
Tell me what led up to this scene.
Tell me what led up to this scene. So for those of you who've read the Topeka School, so much of it is a kind of prehistory for our current political moment, but via different time and place in Kansas in the 80s and 90s, I guess. But I think, but that question of how, so either through the kind of twinning or the kind of haunting of an echo, or as a prehistory or an undercurrent that kind of is the baseline for a scaffolding, I feel like that's what I was mentioning when I was talking about not just time and memory in the kind of classic, boring literary senses of like, how do you write from memory? But I'm really curious, I've never asked you this, about whether or not you feel this temporal abundance in daily life and then try and get at it on the page, or whether or not there's something about writing itself, which is related to another question I want to ask you about therapy or analysis as a big theme in the Topeka School, or whether or not it's something that the activity of writing or speaking makes apparent that was not obvious to you prior to the writing.
I think like this book to feel writable, to me, was about like the calibration of two Adams, like the young Adam, and then the sometimes explicit and sometimes just implied Adam who's living in the present, who's a father, who's trying to remember his childhood from his parents' perspective, and has this weird relation to time because he actually has more imaginative access to his vision of what it was like for his parents than he can like remember what it was like to be an adolescent or a younger kid. But I feel like that some version of that is often operable for me if I can write, like in my first novel, it was kind of about, the Adam Gordon who's being described and who's making all these arguments about his literary fraudulence, and then the person who's written the book, which hopefully is a work of serious enough literature that it ironizes those claims. So kind of calibrating a writer at two different moments and then seeing what moves between those two temporal points feels like what makes some fiction writable for me. But I do think for this book, it was about the way that in a lived daily way, having kids, like that scene in what I read where he's like in the house and floating above it. Like even like in terms of the physical experience of having a little kid, and like you're looking down at the kid, but you're also remembering in a fresh way what it was like to be the little kid looking up. So like you are kind of seeing yourself from above, a version of yourself. So I definitely think the weird tear in time that is becoming a father and the mundane experience of that was part of this book.
It's kind of, it sounds lovely to imagine things twinning or echoing or being a prehistory, but in the scene you just read and when I was just rereading the book, it has a kind of horror aspect often. In 1004, there's kind of like the vertigo of holding the object and feeling all the places the object has been, and it's a kind of like material history way. But in this book, even in what you just read with the house that's not the house, and the guy that's, when the guy turns his face and you see like the pillow falls away, I'm half expecting it to be like, mottled with blood or something. There's just kind of some like real terror in that feeling. And I feel like in this book even more because whether it's Bob Dole on the TV or all these different people, like the horror, like it just, and also obviously for those of you who haven't read the book, but there's a kind of, an act of violence is a kind of structure for the book of a cue ball, kind of set into motion in the beginning that actually is. Maybe that's why I'm thinking of mottled facial blood, because that actually does come to pass in the book. But is that sense of horror something that you relate to the?
Yeah, I think the horror, like it's caught up in the sublime of depersonalization, which is both like a utopian possibility and also like psychosis and like horrifying. So I think that's part of the danger of dividing yourself in literature too, right? Is that you can kind of lose yourself between
right.
the different poles you establish.
Yeah, yeah.
Do I get to ask you a question?
No, yeah, I've got more, so we can go either way.
It's. I have a lot of questions, but I just hearing you. I mean, I've read this amazing book you're working on, a manuscript, but like, even though I've noticed this, like hearing it backstage, I just really heard the emphasis not on freedom as a condition, but freedom as a feeling.
Mm-hmm.
Feeling free. I mean, you were really emphasizing feeling, and I just wanted to hear more about that and its relationship to like the moments of intensity that Bluets tracks. Like, does the feeling of freedom mean that it's something that can be experienced and in a moment of aesthetic transport, even if the political conditions around it are totally busted? Like, what's at stake in the emphasis on feeling and the way you open the book?
That's a hard question,
Yeah.
Ben Lerner. I mean, it's one I need to be able to answer because the book is very, very focused on feeling. I think the reason why I say it's a hard thing to answer is that I feel like there's two things going on in that project about feeling, and I think they're fairly well worked out, but I think that they need to be, and surely you'll help me work them a little bit further out. But one is that as this introduction goes on and talks about Hannah Arendt, it talks about Arendt's very deep-seated conviction that any discussion of feeling free and the feelings of freedom are really like a booby trap for the powerless, and that like political freedom is the only thing that matters, and that it's a form of she says sure, if you want to still be a slave and feel free, go right ahead, but that's not freedom. That's just making yourself feel better, and she tracks it to kind of the birth of Christianity, really, and kind of is much more interested in antiquity, where she doesn't think there was a discourse about freedom at all. And I mean, there is some, but she feels like it really bloomed. I mean, in this sense, her analysis is quite the same as Nietzsche's of slave morality. So on the one hand, okay, I think we're all living in a moment where we're pretty nervous about understanding that, our feeling free as we leave the theater, our feeling free when we go, binge on Netflix later or whatever you're going to do is not commensurate with the political moment about things that are at stake in terms of larger political freedoms. But at the same time, there is a very deep-seated distrust and distaste, and sometimes even disgust, especially in leftist or Marxist circles and in other circles, but for any focus on inner liberation and a feeling that actually focusing on pleasure or good feelings or any practices of liberation that aren't political they're not just delusional, but they're actually toxic insofar as they might, the distrust is the fear that they might, that focus on feeling might take you away from the struggle. I completely don't agree. I mean, I can see that, like, sure, in an instance that might happen, but I completely disagree with that in terms of a spiritually wise and aesthetically robust in all kinds of ways about moving forward and living a life and understanding what kind of life it is that we do want to work towards. So I think that the book is, it charts those two arguments running through it, but it explicitly, beyond this introduction, it leaves questions of political freedom behind and moves only into spheres. The spheres that it discusses are art, drugs, sex, and the climate, standing in for rock and roll, I guess. So art, drugs, sex, and climate, and discussing how feelings of freedom or discourses of freedom are working these days, about sexual freedom or about artistic freedom, about freedom in relationship to global warming and decarbonization, and to the drug drive. And so the book, it kind of begins with this problematic about politics and feeling, but it veers quickly away after that. Is that
Yeah, I mean, I just think like obviously we read very different things, but I think like Adam Gordon in that passage in his Terror also has an experience of a totally politically indefensible, screwed up kind of freedom. But it's this freedom that comes from standardized housing, allowing him to feel a kind of simultaneity that dissolves his individuality. Like he does feel free.
Right.
And
Right,
a kind
right,
of,
right,
there's a lot of horror, but
Yeah.
I think that like, I just think that a lot of the moments of feeling free that you examine in the book are not necessarily about feeling good.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
They're moments of feeling individuality dissolving into collective possibility, even if it can't necessarily be realized. So I'm just thinking that was one.
Yeah, I mean, this is that question, which Ben, for those of you who don't know, has been harping on me for like my entire 4 years of writing this book about what the relationship is between feeling good and feeling free, and I can't answer it for you tonight. I'm going to answer it though in the book. God damn it! No, I'm going to. But let me veer off in a different direction because I can't do that right now. Which is to say that what you just said, which is something else that we talk about a lot, because in 10:04 you have a line that I love about a negative form of something. I mean, something that's a negative form of, do you know what I'm talking about, of possibility, like it's a bad form of...
Yeah, like bundled debt in an economic crisis. It's like a bad form of our social...
Yes, and you do that a lot where, I'm sorry, we're like shorthand talking, but like where you, like capitalism or something like that, where you'll see like in 10:04 a lot, like the net of all the things that are like, or like the internet, whatever, something like certain forms of connectivity. And we'll say, wow, this is weird. Like, this is what we say we're going for in this collectivity or connectivity, except for it's killing us and it's strangling and it's unjust and it's murderous, But you talk about how, what to do with these kind of bad forms of real possibility. And which brings me to my question, which is that I really feel like, I mean, this is true in a lot of your work, but in the Topeka School, it seems really clear that language is atop one of these things for you, in the Topeka School. I mean, as you guys just heard, the stepfather mansplaining or talking about, the Ross Perot China thing, and then, the teenage girl slipping away, Adam's logorrhea in the car that doesn't allow him to notice the amber is left, then later on with Adam's debate career and debate, particularly this form called the spread, being used as a kind of emptying out of meaning and language and weaponizing it. So there's this conversation running all throughout about all the corrosive ways that language is used, but then of course you twin again, the twinning like very close together, the spread, which is language, like you make it the spread analogous to when you see like a pharmaceutical commercial, they go, and the side effects of this include nausea, death, suicidal thoughts, like that whole, that's like a version of the spread is like the fine print that empties meaning and that we're not supposed to understand, even when we really need to understand something. But you twin the spread with, poetry, with language that is, with rap, with all kinds of forms of free-flowing language that doesn't communicate in any kind of direct way. And I just wonder, the dumb version of this question, when it becomes a question and therefore becomes dumb, would say, well, which is it? Like, is language good or bad? But the whole point is that it's neither, and that you're kind of demonstrating all the different things that it can do. But I wonder if you feel that the point of the novel is not of your novel or novels in general, but like one of the points in that novel is to demonstrate all these different possible uses of language more than it is to argue that like, and now watch me write a novel in which I redeem language and show you what it actually can or should do. But the thing is, it kind of does do that too.
Well,
you know what I mean?
I mean, the novel, I just got really interested in, the weird thing about where I grew up was that, there was the institution that ran on talk, which was the Menninger Foundation, because it was like this psychiatric place, and I grew up in a household that valued talk, and then there was this culture beyond it in which talk unless you were talking shit was considered emasculating.
Right.
But then there were these other forms of like ritualized speech that are very embarrassing to look back on, like the spread and debate, or these white middle class kids freestyling. And I wanted to be like really ruthless about the appropriation and the kind of insanity of the near cultic practice, but then also say there are still like experiences of prosody or flow or good moments of depersonalization that put you in touch with the possibilities of language as such, and that is a kind of moment of freedom and renovation, and that the good thing about the total collapse of what passes for public speech in the present is that when you arrive at a certain limit, you have to re-encounter the possibility of building a new language, you know. But I also think the novel the novel depicts all these modes of like weaponized eloquence or the regression to a kind of vocabulary of fascist unreason or whatever, but the novel also wants to itself model a mode of listening, you know, which is kind of in the parent figures, especially in the mother, but also hopefully in the older Adam, who's to a certain degree listening and to those voices from the past. So it's not like the eloquence of the novel as much as it's the perception of patterning and being attuned in a different way to how language was being used in his youth. But I don't know, yeah. Aren't we supposed to?
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, okay. You guys, your turn. Sorry, was that like a murmur from the organizers? I was thinking 9:15 that we needed to talk to, but no, we're done by then, so bring it on. Okay.
Yeah, you guys have to ask
Okay,
questions.
sorry, yeah. We have our whole lives to keep talking.
Oh, it's kind of horrifying when they turn the lights on.
It's because it's like a greenish cast over everybody. It's like the long walk down to the microphone is very daunting, but we're actually very eager to hear what you all have to say, so don't be afraid. Hey.
If we wait long enough, people will come and ask questions. It always works though. We're not going.
Oh, look, yay. Okay, great.
Hey, how's it going?
Hey, how are you?
Good, Maggie.
Good, nice to see you.
Good to see you.
Yeah.
I have some books for you.
Okay, great.
Great. I'll see you
Excellent.
after.
Okay, good.
Maybe we'll take a selfie? Ben, I was really caught by the beginning of your novel and the use of call and response, and how that went back and forth in like with the bat and with the different things that happened on the boat. But then I was really caught by the ability of a gentleman to go into a house that he didn't own and have this completely, this experience that to me seemed surreal and quite dangerous. And so, and Maggie, I noticed also in your work, you were talking a little bit about white privilege and some of whiteness was mentioned in what you read for your upcoming book. So maybe you could talk a little bit about call and response, Ben, and whiteness.
Wait, can you say a lot? Talk about what's the last thing you just said? Sorry.
I said maybe
Talk about.
you could talk about whiteness and how you're playing with that
Okay.
within your new book, and perhaps you can also
Yeah.
talk about that as well.
Yeah, so I mean, and the book talks about this a little bit later in relation to another figure who's a kind of outcast in Topeka, where it talks about like, if you did what Adam did, or if you move around space the way this other white character named Darren did, I mean, they can only survive because of a different relation to police power. I mean, they would be, if no one here needs me to tell them, I hope, that if you were a person of color who found yourself in the wrong house and this white suburban tract housing, you would be in mortal danger, right? And Adam's way of navigating the landscape is totally determined by a different relationship to police power, and just that, even that fantasy, that kind of bad vertigo that also has some moments of possibility of being in all the houses at once, is a fantasy of a kind of interchangeability that I think has to do with whiteness. I mean, a lot of the book is about a kind of vacuity at the heart of whiteness, especially amongst white men, that gets filled with xenophobia and misogyny and violence in different ways. So you're absolutely right. And yeah, the book is really interested in the discourse that was circulating in the 90s a lot about the end of history. Do you hear about this? Like FSG published this book called The End of History.
You hear about this?
Yeah, it was this idea that with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of Soviet Union, like history had ended, and it was just, and then Bill Clinton, beat Dole, and it was supposed to be from now on out, it's just going to be this post-ideological liberal technocrats who are going to kind of solve the world's problems. And I mean, this was obviously a white fantasy if there ever was one. And Adam and a lot of the kind of irony in the book, not irony like in a funny way, but the irony of the book is the older Adam looking back, even though the younger Adam thinks he's pretty savvy about political issues, looking back at all the forms of privilege and ignorance that determine his relation to his political imagination and also the way he negotiates space.
Yeah, I mean, I could say so much here that I would take up our whole rest of the night till midnight, because if you are going to write a book about freedom in the United States, like, as I make clear elsewhere in the introduction, the two most developed discourses around the term are white supremacist, white settler freedom, as one form of freedom, and then, the last 400 or 500 years of Black abolition, emancipatory liberation projects of various kinds, from politics to theology to to all kinds of things, to up to the present prison abolition movements and other things. So I'm very the book tries to really note, like, again, when I'm talking about the Wittgenstein, like the meaning of a word is its use. The book really tries to notice I think we don't really need to learn about how that word is used by the right wing presently, and has been for a long time, as a declaration of violence in so many different shapes and forms, and that even extends to like free speech debates and things now, where the word's like weaponized in this particular way in the right wing. But so the book tries to chart how the word is being used and who's using it. But it also tries not to allow the only two uses of it to be to fall into one of those two categories, because there's also there's a lot else as well, and there's also forms of overlap whereby it can be too easy, I think, to say, oh, that's a collective freedom and that's individual freedom. And like I was saying in the beginning, the book really tries to trouble moments at which, kind of like what you were describing before about depersonalization, moments at which there's more of a weave, or it's more unsure, or a self has different forces moving through it, where sometimes there's a real contrarian individual flight, and at other moments there needs to be a real foundational embrace into a collective we, and so it doesn't try as a project to take one form of freedom and say this is the one that we all need to have it be, to have the world be a better place, but it does try and chart use, Oh, great. Christina, what the heck? Hi, Janet. Oh my God. I can't believe it. Okay. What? Okay, sorry.
Hello.
Hi.
Ben, one of the moments that really struck me in the Topeka School was when Adam is at the park with his daughters and has the encounter with the father of another child who's bullying them. And it really made me think about sort of all of the literature that's been coming out recently, whether novels or nonfiction, about parenthood and especially about motherhood. And so I'm interested in how, I guess you touched on this a little bit earlier, but sort of how becoming a parent and being a father has made you think about what you want to write in the future, and also how you can write something new about parenthood, which is this thing that we've been thinking about for most of history.
Yeah. It's a good question. I mean, I think this book, I mean, you're right, it ends with this scene of the older Adam Gordon negotiating this conflict with another father, which is both like a kind of cliched couple of Brooklyn parents having like differences over parenting strategy, and also like this possible Hobbesian state of nature where he feels like cutting the throat of the other father, you know, but I think that the book for me, I mean, I don't know what will feel writable in the future. I mean, this book is so recently finished, I feel like I'll never write anything again. I'm in one of those moments. But I think for me that this was, that I had to have kids to be able to write the book, but the book isn't about my kids. That there are a lot of books or conversations that are especially written by men, which is like, I had daughters, and then I realized these things. And that this is really more a book about a version of my mother and her father to a certain degree, and about kind of the experiment of writing in her voice, both about her work and also about her difficult father, and trying to think about how my voice, the voice that'll go on to be a voice that's transmitted to a greater or lesser degree to my daughters, but how that was formed, you know, through the language of my mother and others and all these other forces, like a right-wing troll of a debate coach or mass media or whatever, right? So I think for me, it's not like it doesn't have any real ideas about like how to be a parent. It has some ideas and takes some risks trying to think about how to reflect on being a son of a certain sort. And this, I mean, there are versions of both my parents in the book, but I think the relationship between the mother and the son is kind of clearly central. So I don't know. I mean, I think in that playground scene, you know, what's happening is that Adam's like when you become a father, I mean, I assume this is like when you become anything, like you become a bank teller, like you open your mouth and suddenly all this bank teller stuff comes out, right? Like all these things that like you don't say that are just like you've been interpolated into this role start to course through you. So like I definitely think that I'm trying to think about the genealogy of my voice at this moment where I find myself saying stuff to my girls that is, I mean, it's just somebody else talking through, like some expectation of parenting, or sometimes it's my dad, sometimes it's worse than that, you know, but so to think of the intergenerational as this collaboration on this thing called the voice, which like travels across bodies and is never identical to just one person. Yeah, I don't know if that answered the question exactly, but that's kind of what it makes me think about. Thank you.
Is that Vanessa? Hi, Vanessa. This is like,
Hi, how
it's
are
your
you?
life.
To go back to freedom for just a moment, it occurred to me in both of the readings that in one there's a sort of liberatory moment that's very embodied in a very sort of temporal spatial situation, and in the other, the respondents were also
What's that?
the respondents were also talking about, in a sense, the same thing, in a way of some freedom from self. And that seems to be the desire, that the yearning is to escape the trap of the self. But at the same time, the self is the only vehicle with which we can do that. And it seems not coincident that this happens at a time where there's a kind of doubling down on a performance of the self. So I just wanted to hear a little bit more possibly on that.
Where do you doubling down the performance of the self in art or literature, you mean?
I think
Or
all across. I mean, everything from a kind of just the banal, the selfie, to a way of, if not feeling authentic, performing a form of authenticity. There's a call to identify. So, for example, in France, when a lot of people who are liberal would register as conservatives in order to direct what the Conservative Party would do. My feeling is in the United States that wouldn't happen because there's a kind of fidelity to performing an authentic self. Even though we know that ourselves are being monetized on social media, we still insist upon performing some better version of ourselves. So, but it seems like at the same time this is happening, there's also this thing of not wanting to be a self, to be a kind of transcendent self, so to speak. So we seem to be in this chiasmic relationship to, this is what I have, this is all I've got, how do I get out of it?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what to say. I feel like that I have long, as some people here know, long been interested in what might be, be called, what's once called confessional or personal writing, or all different things. I've made a lot of different experiments with the I. I've never felt like any of that was individualistic or trapped in a bubble of self. I just don't see self that way. So like I've never really, in my writing life, which is not really what you're asking about, I think you have a more interesting question than what I'm answering, but I think that I just feel like it's hard for me to track what the culture thinks of as a performance of self, whereas it's not like I don't see self or experience self. Clearly I do, but I have a real sense of all of us like singing together kind of one song, like in these different voices. So I guess, which isn't to say though that, I think in the Freedom Project, I think you're right, that a lot of the correspondents that I am talking to in that book and other people, a lot of the message that you get is that like individuation hurts, individuation is what feels painful, and that's a real thing. It's not, that pain's real, and there are ways of, but Ben thinks a lot more about collectivity and individuality.
No, I mean,
so.
that's an elegant question I don't have an answer to, but I do think it just makes me think about this funny thing that I think we share, which is that we're like really private exhibitionists. Yeah, like we both use all this material. Like I've been like walking around being like, who let out these horrible, embarrassing personal stories about me? That,
Me.
Right, like I did it.
And
like,
over and over again, right?
And I think that that one thing, I don't know if this is true for you exactly, but like it does seem to me that in a world obsessed with the curation of self-image, that it pushes me in two directions. One is to work with really embarrassing material to make it clear that it's not an effort at self-heroicization. But the other thing is just that I think the slower work of literature, like thinking through, as opposed to like social media or whatever, the slower temporality of composition in the book, like lets me, it makes me, it allows me to kind of think through some of these issues without feeling the kind of saturation and speed that are so characteristic of the media ecology generally. But I don't know, I think you're right. I mean, I also just think freedom, I think that the recognition that the self is all you have and that you also want to alter it and the self is also irreducibly social. Like I think, like in the book, like I think freedom is legible against the backdrop of some kind of restriction. Like in my book, I think the freedom that matters is the mother and son's effort to break a pattern of transmission, like to recognize and break a pattern across a family. So like that the recognition of freedom depends upon a kind of restraint or a grammar in which there can be some new move or something. So, but I do, I don't know.
But we have people in the line, so we gotta go to the line over here. Look at,
We're failing to answer any of the questions, but there's people who are still willing to ask more. It's very encouraging.
I think we just want to hear you guys talk. Hi.
Hi.
Ooh, this is really nerve-wracking, thinking of a good question. I first read The Art of Cruelty for the first time in 2016. And in the times I've read it over again since, I've often thought, oh man, I wish this could be like updated for like modern, not modern, contemporary references. You spend a great deal of time talking about truth and facts and narrative and how those can be manipulated or used or weaponized or just kind of altered to become something other. And reading it in 2016 in the summer, and then looking at the state of this country now, it felt very prescient, but also more recently I've been thinking, is this just kind of how it's been par for the course, and that truth and facts have always been used in this way, especially politically, to get an agenda. And I was curious, for both of you as writers, what do you find to be the best or most effective vehicle to transmit true feeling and true thoughts, if that makes sense?
Yeah, it's funny, that book, because there's a lot in it that does seem, it's not that it could seem prescient, but it also just, like, the book seems, like it's more clear to me that its issues about seem more and more age-old in a certain way. I was telling Ben earlier today that that Susan Sontag, I just was reading that she was just saying, like, it looks like we're going to have to keep defending art till, like, the end of time, I guess, even like we might want to just be done with that prospect. And I feel like there's a lot in that book about violence and representation and about aesthetics and representation and truth that are they're age-old, and they will continue to be so. Although this chapter on art in the new book does kind of update a lot of those issues. There's a lot to say here, and we're going to run out of time, so I won't address the issues about the cruelty book. I mean, because it sounds like you're kind of more interested in truth. I don't know. I don't know what truth is, and I don't know. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. I'm gonna just like fuzz out because I don't know what it is. I mean, there's yeah. Okay, you don't know. It's good. We'll move on. We don't know what it is.
I don't know.
Okay, all right.
It's
We'll talk later. Find us later. Okay, we'll be here. Okay, great. Okay, it's gonna get really slap happy as you're trying.
I've got one over here.
Okay, great.
Great. Ben, I think that there's something to be said for a lot of great work, at least that I've really related to, coming from people who feel like they're outsiders. I found that in writing 1004, I felt that it's a story about feeling outside of a romantic potential relationship with then the mother of your child. And in Leaving the Atocha Station, which I finished just earlier this week, it is, of course, being the gringo fraud in Spain. But I mean, it's a lot deeper than that. I don't mean to just bake it into that. I'm wondering if sitting on this stage today with the recent drop of your new novel, if you still today feel like an outsider, and what that means for your work going forward.
Well, yeah, I mean, like, I feel like the novels that I love, I mean, there are novels that aren't this way, but I feel like this is really fundamental for the novel as a form, are about a kind of felt disconnect, an individual's felt disconnect from the social. Like, that's what novels are good at depicting, right? Like, that, and they're really good at depicting that because they can both depict social behavior and they can depict interiority. And I think the novel's kind of still the tops for the depiction of interiority. So I can assure you that I feel alienated in a wide array of ways. But I don't actually know what a novel would look like that didn't have some element of that tension or friction between an individual and social possibility. So I guess I'm just saying, I think maybe to a certain degree that's part of the definition of the genre, is that it depends. It doesn't always mean that it has to be tragic or painful. It can be funny and whatever. But the novel is a machine that presumes an alienated world.
Hi, I have a question about process mostly.
It's a little hard to hear you. Yeah.
I guess, is this better?
Yes, it is.
I have a question about process, and I really enjoy how both of your works are deeply psychological and meandering and have a flow to them, but are also philosophical, have that philosophical groundwork. I was wondering, how do you toe the line between being confessional, but then also maybe like trusting what you write? Do you trust everything you write?
If we did, we wouldn't need each other. Trust like it?
That it's actually how you feel or what you think.
Trust what you feel. Like when you assert something, do you like what you said, kind of?
Like when you put it on paper, is it a true representation of what you're thinking or feeling, or is it just become something else when you translate it?
I think if writing were just scribing a thought where nothing happened between the thought and then writing it down, it would be a very boring activity. It might be more satisfying because then it would just be a pure act of transmission. But I often think I have a thought that's worth writing down, and the very act of entering into syntax, I suddenly don't know what I think anymore, and you have to come up with a subject and predicate, and you have to come up with a verb that's correct, and all those things are just something, what do I think? What do I think? And that's the work of writing. I mean, that's what thinking on the page is. It's not always pleasant because it takes a while to know what you think, and sometimes you never know what you think in a definitive sense. But I think something I really, recognize in Ben's writing, which I really admire, and is that, he's attentive to every word being the right word, and there's not, and when I can't remember what book it was, I'm sure you can remind me, maybe it was The Argonauts, but I said, I think I'm done, it's good enough, I'm done, and he was like, you better make yourself a really big iced coffee and get your pen out, and you go through that one more time, and you make sure every word was the right word, and I was like, okay, but that's that's what you need as a writer, you never can give up and say that it's good enough. If it's just, a little fuzz around the edges here and there with a few bad words or a little bad sentence, it's not good enough, and Ben is here to remind me of that. We're just FYI, because in case you're all suffering, we're 10 minutes over when we've been told to end our event.
Oh,
I think both of us are feeling like these people look really nice, and we can
just go really quickly through the last.
Okay, we're going to blow through these three over here.
There's a question over here. And people can leave.
Yeah, and you can leave, and you can leave, and now that we're over the time, we won't feel. Look, if people are leaving, so let's go. We won't feel upset. We're just.
Okay. Hi.
Hi.
I have two very short questions.
By part.
Yes. So the new thing you were writing about, you said something about there's a freedom that I cannot have alone. Do you feel more free now, being here,
Right.
or writing alone in your room?
That I didn't say. I was quoting somebody who said that. But I think that. I've thought a lot about this in that project, which is kind of actually what I was just saying to her, which is that, like what Ben was just saying about only seeing freedom in vis-a-vis a restriction, and what I would describe, after my mind's been in this project for a long time, about his mom and himself, I would describe it as flipping a constraint, which is a Brian Masumi phrase. Like, the practice of learning how to flip constraints is not the same as jumping out of a plane and being like, woo, I'm flying free! It's not the same thing, but I find it actually much more satisfying, and I think the act of writing can be learning how to flip a constraint over and over and over again. And insofar as I keep doing it, sure, I feel that,
Great, thank you.
Okay, great, okay, wait, but now we gotta go this way. Okay, what?
What kind of music do you like to listen to?
What?
Music. What kind of music do you like to listen to?
You say something quickly, and we gotta get to
I like the Robert Wyatt cover of Elvis Costello's song "Shipbuilding."
Fantastic. Okay, great. All right, this is it. These three, and then we're done.
Yeah.
So I think my question is sort of similar, or expanding on the question 2 ago and talking about a true representation. For what you've put out is a true representation, because you could write anything, you could do it in any number of ways. And I guess I was thinking about sort of how you, in terms of the composing process as a writer, settle in or situate yourself in between the two sets of poles, one set being just, we were talking about different selves and sort of that pulsing notion of toggling between perspectives, how you as a writer sort of situate between just one linear strand, one linear thread, and then the different alternatives to that, like all other possible options, and also in terms of language, like the closest thing to a private language, or like Ben, in your fiction, how maybe a lot of parallels between yourself and the protagonist, like how you might adopt sort of a shorthand that would parallel like the experiences of people who would have shared those as well, and then something that's totally explicit, like for an audience or for a reader, like what settles between those two sets of poles to be like the true representation or the thing that you feel is best.
I don't know. I mean, I guess I would just say the best and worst thing about writing is that there's no general, I don't have a strategy, you know. I mean, things feel writable for me often when two different points in time come into an unexpected correspondence, and I feel like I can write from one and the other or shuttle between them, but I have kind of no control over when and why it happens. Yeah. But what you're describing are, I think, the challenges and the issues. I don't think it can be administered, you know. I think you just have to write.
All right, let's do these two more and then, okay.
Thanks.
Hi, so I just have a question. I'm sorry, I have to be on my toes here. I have a question about just like how we can talk to each other, and I don't think this is an easily answerable question, but I don't know, I think like you were talking about the dichotomy of the two main ways that people see freedom or think about freedom, and there's obviously a lot more different ways that people think about it. And I like love the simplicity of Wittgenstein's thought of like, it's what we mean, but there's like sort of this whole spectrum of meanings that people are talking about when they're talking about things. And so I'm wondering if you have any ideas about like, either of you have any ideas about what would be the best way to like succeed at communicating and also to get people engaged in communication like at this sort of deeper level. Not just the people like that are in this room, but like anybody on the street.
Things like the levels are upping like in a fractal fashion as this goes on. No, I would just say that. I think I'm an annoying person in the sense that I'm a parser like of phrases and language. So like if we're talking, I mean, I'm not kidding when I say what are we talking about? Negative freedom, positive freedom? Like, I mean, I really want to know what we're talking about. And to me, talking, and to some extent my writing practice, especially critically, is a kind of burrowing in to, you know, I don't mean this, I do mean this, I mean it this way, this is where this is used, this is how I, you know, you know, friends like Ben who are really smart, who can keep me away from endless hedging, can keep that kind of beveled aspect of thinking moving towards a kind of satisfying target as opposed to just kind of an endless beveling that kind of drifts off into the distance, you know. But moving on.
Yeah,
okay, yeah, okay.
I
All right.
know
Okay,
it's
yeah,
a-
okay, great.
I
All right,
wish-
last
I wish I
question.
knew.
All right, great.
So quick.
No, it's all good. We're good. This is it. This is the last question, so
We're
just gonna
sailing
relax.
off into the
Okay, yeah, exactly.
So, the Topeka School is obviously a book which is very interested in voice and perspective, and it shifts sort of point of view a lot. And what we heard that you read is obviously in a kind of close third. And I was curious if you could speak a little bit to some of the choices of the kind of perspectival shifts, and then perhaps how you came to decide that introducing Adam in this close third would be sort of maybe most fecund for irony, or to allow that kind of poking fun at his quick to anger kind of personality.
Yeah. Well, it turned out that I couldn't write a version of my 16-year-old speech or 17 or 18-year-old speech in the first person. Like, I really tried, and I could do it in a way that was funny, that was just like kind of showing how ridiculous he was, but I couldn't do it in a way that could hold any of the emotional, and I couldn't even remember it. I mean, luckily there was no YouTube or whatever. So, but basically I didn't have access to that in the first person. And then, like I was saying, like I did have this feeling that what's making this feel at all writable is that I actually feel closer to my parents as they were when I was a kid. Like that correspondence more than I have an ability to recall the 17-year-old version of myself. So I decided to write the Adam sections in the third person and then the parents in the first person. And Adam only parents have the first person in the book. I mean, later Adam shows up a little in a coda when he has the first person. But I also didn't. the goal was not, for me, I mean, some novelists are really good at this, are really interested. The goal for me was not to like create a perfect version of the mother's voice where you totally forget that you're reading. To me, the drama and the emotional content was in the fact that this is the older Adam trying to ventriloquize, trying to write in a mother's voice. So there are all these tears in the voices, or moments where it's structurally acknowledged that this isn't the father Jonathan speaking. This is the son Adam trying to reconstruct the father Jonathan's voice. And that's a little bit of a different artistic project. And that to me had the kind of psychic and aesthetic risk more, trying to get the levels of that right. Thank you all.
You guys, thank you so much. Thank you. And